Let's discuss on today's topic is a transactions type in a bank. So in perspective, I'll explaining this thing in a transaction monitoring system, and you will get understand what are the different types of transactions in the bank or in the financial institution like SWIFT, RTGS, NEFT, and the SPA. So I'll explain you each one by one and at what level these transactions are using and what are the risks in that transaction. So we will discuss all these things in this video. So let's start with the first transaction, which we call the SWIFT. SWIFT is basically stand for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. So it's the international level transactions happening between the two cross-border transactions. So the scope of the SWIFT are the international message system, and it is not directly payment the system, it's not directly to the payment, it's to the international level of the messages transaction between the two different banks, or it is and the cross border remittance, and that we will use the cross border transactions for the trade finance and the securities transaction. There is huge volume done in the trade finance, billions and crores, billions level of the transaction between different countries with their the buying and selling of the assets for the so that all these things done with the swift transactions. And also the risks related to the transaction monitoring system for the swift transaction is the very important and high risk things we need. Anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing kinds of risks is there, the risks related to that, and that must be screen sanctions or the transaction monitoring, name sanctioning or sanction screening will the sender and receiver of that amount is they are the is the part of the blacklist or the UN sanction list or the American sanction list, or they are the banned to the banking transaction. So we need to verify that things, and the alliance says suspicious corresponding banking we need to check before doing that transaction successfully. So bank will check these things, and there are the some message type we can understand from that it is a customer type transaction, or it is a bank to bank transaction, or it is a statement required by the person. So MTI 01 is for the MTI 103 is for the customer transaction, and if MT 202 is for the bank transaction, that transaction will happen between the different banks, different countries, and this transaction will be the cross border remittance. And MT 940 is the statement like the request. And the risks in the SWIFT transaction with Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication transaction are the money laundering, terrorist financing, laying via correspondent accounts, and clean the money and do the financing for the terrorists. So that's we need. These are the risks are very high risks in this transaction because these are the cross-border transactions. So let's move on the next. It is an RTGS, which we also call the real-time cross settlement, which is specially used in India, and also the Sri Lanka will also use the RTGS for real-time cross settlement. So the scope of this kind of transaction, it is at the domestic transaction. It's the transaction which happen on the country level, and the high payment in the Indian rupee. So it has the high value of the payment, more than 2 lakhs. If you want to do the RTGS transaction, so the amount should be greater than 2 lakhs, and it is real time of the transaction settlement. It's happening while you are click on the send button. So that's at the time real time transaction. It will done within the second each kind of transaction. So the transaction relating monitor the large value transaction. Sudden we need to run the do the and sudden spike, unnecessary beneficiary pattern, AML, or the some parties transfer the fund, and risks in this kind of the real time gross transaction, which we called RTGS, is restructuring, high value fraud, and the corporate account misuse. Someone use the misuse of corporate account and transact high value of funds to the sanction list person or the blacklist person to the illegal activities, or which someone wants to clean their money. So that's they help us to the monitor the RTGS transactions, or the sanctions screening, or the name screening for the RTGS transaction. And then let's move on the NEFT, that's which called a National Electronic Fund Transfer, and it is also within the India. So the scope of the NEFT transaction is at the domestic level. If we want to transfer the funds from the domestic level, then we will use the NEFT, and it is an the Indian rupees transfer. So we need to transfer the Indian rupees, so that the NEFT transactions will use by the retail and bulk payment, and it is available for 4 by 7 batch processing in every 30 minutes. If you do the transaction in NFTs, so that's a batch will created, and every 30 minutes that transaction will be settled. Okay. And then the transaction monitoring setting relevance for this kind of the transaction, monitor frequency and velocity of small value transfer. We need to identify if there is a threshold amount of that country. In India, suppose 1 lakh rupees. If your transaction is above 1 lakh rupees, then the bank or banking system will monitor your transaction, the sanctions screen. So for that, to avoid the transfer more than 1 lakh rupees, the fraudulent the person or the people will transfer 99,000 or the 90,000, and frequently the frequency will increase these kind of the transactions. So we need to monitor the count of transaction and the transaction amount, identify the fraudulent activities and the true positive activities, and remove the false positive activities in the system. So monitor the frequency and velocity of small value transfers, and the risks in that such kind of transaction is a spoofing full account. The someone creates an ID and create their own account in the fraudulent ID, and the e-commerce activities will done by these the criminals kind of transactions. We need to understand these kind of the transaction very well. Then let's move on the SEPA, which is the single euro payment areas. So that the SEPA is specifically for the EV and EEA countries, that countries use, and they are all these transactions will done only in the euro currency. So these are their the these specific countries, they are doing the SPA transaction within that country, within these countries, and that transaction will be happen in the euro. Euro is the currency, so it's and the cross border transaction was the low cost, because SWIFT we consider as the banking, it will take high cost as compared to euro. So they define their the local level, that's the singular euro payment area transaction within that countries, and this also one of the kind of the cross border transactions. Okay, and the transaction monitoring relevance of the single euro payment area is the monitoring ultra EVA payment for the sanctioned entities and the suspicious pattern. So that will continuously monitoring name screening and identify the if the payment receiver or the payment sender will be the sanction part, or we are doing the terrorist financing, or that fund is used for the illicit activity. So we need to do monitoring name screening of this transaction for the beneficiary of this transaction, and the suspicious pattern we should identify from this transaction, and risk terrorist financing laying of fund within the UAN bank. So we need to the risk is terrorist financing laying of fund and the EVN banks between the EVN banks. So we need these identification. So on the this one is the last slide. So comparison of transaction types. So we need to compare the SWIFT transaction, RTGS transaction, NEFT, and the SWIFT SEPA transaction, and the transaction monitoring system impact on this transaction. So SWIFT is a global level transaction. It's done within the different country level, different cross-border transaction and multiple currency which involved in this transaction, and it is high costly and hours or day required to complete this transaction, and this transaction contain the high risks of anti-money laundering and CFT, because it is at the cross-border transactions between different two countries. And then the RTGS, it is at the domestic level transaction. In India, it's between the India with different reason return, and in this transaction return in the IRL, instant high value monitoring return is to monitor this transaction. And then the NEFT, it is also the domestic level transaction. It is within the India, but it is the retail or the small scale of transaction as compared with the RTGS transaction. And near real time and the small value monitoring will require to identify these transactions. And for the NEFT, most of the criminals is use for to do the transaction at the minimum level of the threshold amount, and to clean their money, and to to do the financing for the terrorists. So NFT is a stop time use. And then the SEPA, it is an the EU origin specific transaction, and it is done on the EU currency only. And then it is the next or same dates. Require the minimum days the settlement of the amount. It is done by the same day, or it will take the next day, and the ultra monitor system will require such kind of the monitor or the name screening or the sanction screening of these kind of transactions to identify the beneficiary and the sender. And the TMS must adopt monitoring rules of each type of transaction. So TMS must have capability to monitor or the inbuilt rules of to do the red flag. If there is the system will identify the fraudulent transaction, the transaction monitoring system will identify the fraudulent transaction. So name screening or the sanction screening or the transaction monitoring system have capability to detect such kind of transaction and the red flag, and to freeze these such kind of accounts whenever the compliance team will do the identification and identify the fraudulent transaction. So these are the slides I want to cover related to the transaction type in banking, respective of transaction monitor, perspective of the transaction monitoring system. So if you like these videos, and if you find interesting these videos, please like and subscribe my channel. I'll that will motivate me to create more and more content videos. Thank you so much for attending this video.